As part of Connecticut's 350th anniversary, Connecticut Public Radio invites you to reflect on the events that have shaped and continue to shape life in our state. Remembering Connecticut. James Mars, a slave in Connecticut. In the 1860s, Deacon James Mars wrote an account of his boyhood as a slave in Connecticut. This autobiography helps us understand in the most basic human terms how it felt to be treated as property. James Mars was 8 years old when his owner, the minister in North Canaan, Litchfield County, sold him to a local farmer named Munger. James was sickened by the thought that he might never see his family again. But as it turned out, his father, Jupiter Mars, found work in the area. James was able to see his family on the one night every other week that Mr. Munger allowed him out. Munger had no sons to help him on the farm, so James did a man's work while white children of his age were in school. James lived under the same roof with the Mungers, shared their table, and grew fond of the family, but his lack of schooling haunted James for the rest of his life. Another matter bothered young Mars.
Mr. Munger was fond of using the lash. I made up my mind that if I ever was the strongest, I would pay back some of it.
When James was 16, and indeed the stronger, he asserted his physical advantages.
Mr. Munger said I had not done what I ought to have. I told him I had done just what he told me. That was more than I had ever said before. He was angry. He got his horsewhip and said he would learn me. He raised his hand and stood ready to strike. I said, "You had better not." I then went out at the door.
James saved himself from further whipping, but Munger boiled in anger. To James, it seemed as if drink or disease were affecting Munger.
I felt grieved to see him in such a rage when I'd done just what he told me, and I could not account for it. If he'd been a drinking man, I should not have wondered, but he was not. He was a sober man. I could not get over my feeling for some time.
What James had seen in Munger's face was indeed a disease. The disease of racism, which was just as virulent in a Yankee farmer as in a Southern planter. In 1790, the year of James' birth, reform-minded ministers had pushed an emancipation bill through the state legislature. The law established that any black person born in Connecticut would automatically attain freedom at the age of 25. Then, in 1797, the legislature lowered the age of emancipation from 25 to 21. So when James turned 21, he believed he should have his freedom, but Munger tried desperately to retain ownership. Knowing that physical threats no longer swayed Mars, Munger turned to legalistic means to keep him. Munger's nephew was a lawyer, and he told Munger that since Mars was born in 1790, before the change in the law, that the older statute applied. Not having access to legal advice, Mars took the only option he could see and fled, leaving behind the small herd of cows that he had built up while in Munger's employ. Munger eventually gave up his claim, and when Mars returned to the area, the Mungers were able to express the affection they had developed for Mars during the 13 years he was part of their household.
They always treated me with attention whenever I met them. They made me welcome to their house and to their table.
Mars and the Mungers attended the same church, and when Munger's daughter was dying, she asked for Mars to tend her during her last days. Munger himself, when facing death, remembered the friendship that grew between him and Mars as they shared toil in the fields, and not the bile of prejudice that had split them.
He sent for me. I went to him, and he said he wished to have me stay with him. I told him I would, and I stayed with him until he died. I closed the eyes of his daughter when she died, and his also. And now to look back on the whole transaction, it all seems like a dream. It is all past, never to be reacted.
In Hartford, in the 1830s, Mars lived through anti-black riots. And as he wrote in his autobiography, the nation was convulsing in the Civil War that brought an end to slavery. Unfortunately, his hope that racism was completely in the past was only the optimism of a generous and sentimental old man.